The war room of the Vakros Dominion gleamed with the light of 1,000 conquered stars. Each point of light on the massive holographic display represented a world brought to heel, a civilization crushed beneath the weight of the greatest empire the galaxy had ever known. For 3,000 years, the Vakros had expanded without pause, their military might unmatched, their superiority unquestioned. Captain Hyan stood before a small terminal in the archives section, far from the celebrations happening in the main command center. His scaled fingers moved across the ancient interface, pulling up files that most of his people had forgotten existed. These were the final transmissions of dead civilizations, their last words before the Dominion erased them from history. He had found something disturbing in these digital graves. 7 different species, separated by thousands of light years and centuries of time, had left similar warnings. They all mentioned the same thing: humans. The first warning came from the Pelthic Confederation, extinct for 400 years. Their final database entry was brief but panicked. Do not engage the humans in prolonged conflict. They do not stop. They do not forgive. We thought them weak. We were wrong. Another came from the Harkin Empire, destroyed 3 centuries ago. Human ships are inferior. Human weapons are outdated. Human tactics are predictable. Yet we are losing. They adapt too quickly. Each defeat teaches them. Each victory costs us more than the last. By the time you read this, it will be too late for us. Hyan brought these warnings to his superior, Commander Taiyang. The commander's office overlooked the Dominion's capital world, a planet that had never known the shadow of an enemy ship. Taiyang listened to Hyan's presentation with growing impatience, his 4 eyes narrowing in what the Vakros considered amusement. You disturb my morning with ghost stories? Taiyang clicked his mandibles together in dismissive laughter. These species were weak. They fell because they deserved to fall. The Dominion has crushed 847 civilizations. What are humans but number 848? Hyan tried again. Sir, the pattern is consistent across multiple sources. These warnings describe capabilities that don't match our current intelligence on human military strength. They mention psychological warfare, cultural adaptability, and something called mutually assured destruction. Taiyang waved a clawed hand. I've read the intelligence reports on humanity, Captain. They have a modest fleet of perhaps 12,000 combat vessels. Their weapons technology is 2 generations behind our own. They've barely colonized 50 systems. They're insects waiting to be stepped on. Then why do 7 extinct civilizations mention them specifically? Because the weak always fear something, Taiyang said. Perhaps these species encountered early human explorers and mistook curiosity for threat. Or perhaps they invented a convenient excuse for their own failures. It doesn't matter. The War Council has made its decision. The human systems contain resources we need. They will surrender or they will die. 3 days later, the ultimatum was delivered to every human world simultaneously. The message was simple and had been used successfully 847 times before. Surrender all military assets. Accept client race status. Provide tribute. Refuse and face total extermination. On the colony world of Nova Sol, Administrator Minji received the message in her office overlooking the planet's capital city. The city had been built by the first wave of colonists just 40 years ago. Now it housed 3 million people, with farms spreading across the continents and factories humming with productivity. It was a young world, still raw and unfinished, but it was home. She forwarded the message to Earth immediately and called an emergency meeting of the Colonial Council. The council members gathered in stunned silence as they watched the Vakros ultimatum play on the main screen. The alien voice was translated by their computers, each word precisely chosen to convey absolute authority. This is not a negotiation, the message concluded. You have one standard cycle to respond. Choose wisely. One of the council members, a farmer named Do-yun, spoke first. Can we even fight them? The reports say they have millions of ships. Minji pulled up the intelligence data that Earth had sent along with the ultimatum. Their fleet is large, but it's spread across hundreds of systems. The force they're sending toward our space is estimated at 20,000 vessels. Our combined human fleet is about 12,000 ships. So we're outnumbered, another council member said. In ships, yes, but we have advantages they don't know about. Minji highlighted sections of the intelligence report. The Vakros have never fought a peer conflict. Every war they've won has been against technologically inferior species. They rely on overwhelming force because it's always worked before. They don't know how to fight an enemy that can fight back. But we can't win, Do-yun said. Even if we destroy their initial fleet, they'll just send more. They have an entire empire behind them. Minji looked at each council member in turn. Winning isn't about who has the most ships. It's about who's willing to pay the highest price. We need to buy time. Time to evacuate civilians. Time to fortify our positions. Time to make them understand that conquering humanity will cost more than any empire can afford to pay. The message Earth sent back to the Vakros was polite and requested more time for consideration. Taiyang read it and smiled. He had seen this before. The humans were stalling, hoping for a miracle that would never come. In 3 weeks, when their time ran out, they would surrender like all the others. He was so certain of this that he barely read Captain Hyan's final report on the ancient warnings. The report included one fragment that had been heavily encrypted, only recently decoded. It was from a species called the Drexen, extinct for over a millennium. The fragment read, "We thought the warnings were exaggerations. We thought we could control the escalation. We thought wrong. If you are reading this, you have already made our mistake. The humans have a saying, don't mistake kindness for weakness. We did. Now we are gone." Taiyang deleted the report and ordered the fleet to advance. In his mind, the war was already over. Humanity would be added to the list of conquered species within a month. The Vakros dominion would continue its expansion, as it had for 3,000 years. He could not imagine that in less than 3 years, his entire civilization would cease to exist. That every warning his people ignored would prove true. That humanity, when pushed to the edge, would not simply fight back, but would ensure that whoever pushed them would fall into the void first. The Vakros fleet crossed into human space, confident and overwhelming. And humanity, watching them come, began to show what 3 billion years of evolution on a death world had created. Not the strongest species, not the fastest, but the most stubborn, the most creative, and the most absolutely unwilling to go quietly into extinction. The galaxy was about to learn a lesson it would never forget. Vakros Armada emerged from hyperspace at the edge of the Sejong system like a swarm of metal locusts. 20,000 warships, each one larger than a human cruiser, their weapons powered and shields active. Fleet Marshal Korath commanded from his flagship, a dreadnought that had participated in the conquest of 42 civilizations. This would be 43. The initial scans confused him. The system's defensive satellites were active and tracking his fleet, but there was no military presence in orbit around the colony world. No battleships holding defensive positions. No carrier groups preparing to engage. Just civilian traffic moving in organized patterns away from the planet. "They're evacuating," his tactical officer reported. "Civilian transports are moving colonists to the outer system." Korath clicked his mandibles in satisfaction. "They surrender already. Send fighters to intercept the transports. We'll accept their submission and begin resource extraction immediately." The fighter wings launched, sleek Vacross interceptors moving to corral the fleeing civilian ships. That's when everything changed. The first transport exploded when the fighters came within weapons range. Not from taking fire, but from a deliberate self-detonation that vaporized 3 Vacross interceptors and damaged 5 more. Then another transport exploded, and another, each one positioned precisely to maximize damage to the pursuing fighters. "They're using their civilians as weapons," the tactical officer said, disbelief in his voice. Before Koreth could respond, the asteroid belt came alive. Every mining station, every processing facility, every automated drone suddenly activated weapons that hadn't been there 3 weeks ago. Railguns that should have been mining equipment. Missiles that should have been cargo containers. Lasers that should have been cutting tools. Ensign Yemen crouched in the control room of Mining Station 7, his hands steady on the targeting controls, despite his racing heart. 3 weeks ago, he had been a civilian mining engineer. Now he was a soldier in a war he never wanted but would fight to his last breath. "Target lock on Dreadnought Section 7, he reported to his small crew. The station had been converted into a weapons platform, using nothing but mining equipment and salvaged parts. It wouldn't last long against a military assault, but it didn't need to. He pressed the firing button. The mining laser, overcharged to twice its safety limit, burned through the void and scored a line across the Dreadnought's shields. The beam wasn't powerful enough to penetrate, but that wasn't the point. The point was to make them react. The Dreadnought did react, turning a dozen-point defense weapons toward the tiny mining station. Yemen and his crew were already running toward the escape pods. They launched just as the station exploded behind them, but their laser had done its job. The Dreadnought had shifted position by 3 degrees. That 3-degree shift put it exactly where the real weapons were waiting. Missiles launched from hollowed-out asteroids, each one a former cargo hauler packed with explosives and guided by a simple AI. They slammed into the Dreadnought's exposed reactor section. The shields held, but the impact forced another position change. This was humanity's strategy. Death by 1,000 cuts. Every civilian vessel, a potential bomb. Every piece of infrastructure, a potential weapon. Every human a combatant who would trade their life for even the smallest advantage. The Vacross had overwhelming firepower, but they had to identify and destroy each threat individually. The humans just had to keep creating threats faster than the Vacross could eliminate them. Captain Hyon watched the battle from his intelligence vessel, hanging back from the main engagement. His sensors recorded everything, and what he saw disturbed him more than any previous battle in his career. The humans were broadcasting. Not military communications that could be jammed, but wide-spectrum civilian broadcasts that any receiver in the system could pick up. They were showing their own deaths. Every destroyed station transmitted its final moments. Every sacrificed ship sent its crew's last words. Every soldier who died made sure their death taught the next human fighter something useful. The broadcasts weren't propaganda. They were lessons, instructions, tactical data being shared in real time across the entire human network. The Vacross destroyed mining station after mining station, fought through the asteroid belt, eliminated the automated defenses. But each victory cost ships, and each destroyed human position revealed new information about Vacross weapons, tactics, and vulnerabilities. Information that was immediately transmitted to every other human defender. The battle lasted 6 hours. The Vacross won, because mathematics eventually favored the larger force. But Koreth stared at his casualty reports in disbelief. He had expected to lose perhaps 50 ships in the entire campaign. He had lost over 2,000 in a single system, fighting nothing but converted civilian infrastructure and volunteer crews. Acceptable losses, he told his officers, though his voice carried less certainty than before. We proceed to the colony world. The colony world itself was empty. The evacuation had been complete. 3 million people had been moved to transports that were already jumping to hyperspace, carrying them deeper into human territory. The Vakros claimed an empty planet and declared the Sejong system pacified. On Earth, scientist Somin watched the battle recordings with her team. They had 6 hours of detailed combat footage showing the Vakros ships in action. Every weapon discharge, every shield fluctuation, every tactical formation. The people of Sejong had died to gather this intelligence. "Run the analysis again," she ordered. "I want to know the exact frequency of their shields, the recharge rate of their weapons, and the composition of their armor. They bought us this data with their lives. We're going to use it." Her team worked through the night. By morning, they had preliminary designs for weapons, specifically calibrated to exploit Vakros defensive systems. The designs were transmitted to every shipyard in human space. Pilot Yuna sat in the cockpit of her new fighter, familiarizing herself with controls that were still warm from the factory. The fighter wasn't elegant. It wasn't designed to impress or intimidate. It was designed to kill Vakros ships as efficiently as possible, using the intelligence gathered at Sejong. She had watched the battle recordings like everyone else. She had seen Ensign Yemen's mining station make its final stand. She had heard the last transmission from Transport 17 before it detonated itself to save Transport 18. She had learned what her commanders needed her to learn, that victory wasn't measured in survival, but in cost, imposed on the enemy. Her fighter was part of a new production run. 20,000 vessels built in 3 weeks, using techniques that prioritized speed over quality. They would probably fall apart after a dozen missions, but they only needed to last long enough to make the Vakros pay. Commander Tai Yang reviewed the Sejong battle reports in his office. 2,000 ships lost. That was more than the Dominion had lost in the previous decade of conquest combined. But the system was pacified. The humans would see the futility of resistance and surrender. He sent a message to the War Council, assuring them that human resistance would collapse after a few more demonstrations of Vakros superiority. The Council, comfortable in their palace on a world that had never known war, accepted his assessment. Captain Hyon filed his own report, but he knew no one would read it carefully. His report detailed the human broadcasts, the tactical adaptation, the willingness to sacrifice everything for marginal advantages. He noted that humanity was not fighting to win the battle. They were fighting to learn. Every engagement was a test. Every sacrifice was an investment in future victory. The Vakros fleet moved deeper into human space, confident that their overwhelming force would break human resistance within weeks. They had no concept of what they had just initiated. They had fought and defeated an enemy that wanted to lose, because losing taught them what they needed to know. In the command centers of Earth, Mars, and the outer colonies, human admirals studied the Sejong data and refined their strategies. They had learned the first lesson. The Vakros could be hurt. Now they needed to learn how to make that hurt permanent. The war was just beginning, and only one side understood what that meant. 3 months into the war, the Vakros Dominion controlled 12 human systems. On paper, it looked like a successful campaign. In reality, Fleet Marshal Korath was bleeding his forces to death, one system at a time. Each conquered world followed the same pattern. Evacuated civilians, weaponized infrastructure, defenders who traded their lives for tactical data and enemy casualties. The Vakros won every battle, but each victory felt less like triumph and more like stepping deeper into a trap. Captain Hyon compiled his reports in the intelligence vessel, watching his people march toward disaster and unable to stop them. The numbers told a story that the War Council refused to hear. The Dominion had committed 40% of its forward fleet to the human conflict and lost nearly half of that force. Meanwhile, human ship production was accelerating. not declining. He had intercepted human military communications that should have been encrypted but were broadcast openly, as if they wanted the Vakros to hear. One message stuck in his mind: we're not trying to win quickly. We're trying to teach them that every human world costs more than it's worth. Make them understand that conquering us means destroying themselves. Behind Vakros lines, in the occupied systems, a different kind of war was being waged. Engineer Junho led a cell of resistance fighters on what had been the colony world of New Bizan. The Vakros occupiers had expected the population to submit once their military was defeated. They had miscalculated badly. Junho's workshop was hidden in the basement of what appeared to be an abandoned factory. His team used commercial fabricators, the kind meant for making furniture and spare parts, to produce weapons. The designs came from the Resistance Network, shared across occupied space through entertainment channels and commercial networks that the Vakros didn't bother to monitor. The shipment arrives tonight, his second in command. A former teacher named Yunji told him. Medical supplies, officially. Actually, it's the components we need for the jammers. Junho nodded, his attention focused on the device he was assembling. It looked like a simple power generator, the kind used in every Vakros military outpost. It would function as a power generator, right up until someone activated the hidden secondary function that would overload every Vakros electronic system within 200 meters. How many can we build? He asked. 20, maybe 30 before they noticed the missing components. Make it 50. I'd rather risk detection than leave them operational basis. The Vakros had destroyed 3 cities as examples, trying to terrorize the population into compliance. Instead, they had created 50,000 Junhos, each one determined to make the occupation as costly as possible. Every Vakros soldier needed guards. Every supply convoy needed escorts. Every base needed constant patrols. The occupiers were learning what empires throughout human history had learned. Holding territory only works if the occupied population accepts defeat. Humans didn't accept defeat. On Earth. Psychologist Hana briefed Admiral Do-Yun on the Vakros psychological profile her team had developed. The Admiral, who now commanded humanity's combined fleet, listened carefully. Understanding the enemy meant knowing how to break them. The Vakros operate on a strict hierarchy, Hana explained. Individual initiative is punished. They follow orders without question because their entire society is built on the idea that authority is always correct. This makes them predictable. How do we exploit that? Do-Yun asked. We create situations where following orders leads to disaster, but deviating from orders is culturally impossible. We make them choose between losing battles and violating their own nature. Do-Yun smiled grimly. Psychological warfare. They're not ready for it. No species they've conquered has been capable of it. Most primitive cultures don't have the infrastructure. Most advanced cultures surrender before it becomes necessary. We're the first opponent who's both capable and desperate enough to use it. The briefing was interrupted by an urgent message. Captain Hyon had managed to transmit a data packet through back channels, risking his life to get information to the human command. The packet contained decoded fragments from the ancient warnings, including detailed references to human tactics. One fragment stood out. It was from the Drexen civilization, extinct for 1,000 years. The translation was rough but clear. Human cultural concept identified, mutually assured destruction. If victory is impossible, they will ensure mutual annihilation. They would rather die with their enemy than live under their rule. No species we have encountered shares this mindset. Recommendation: do not engage in total war with humans under any circumstances. Do-Yun read it twice. Then he called a meeting of the Terran Council in orbit around Mars. The shipyards that had built humanity's first generation of warships were now producing something different. Pilot Yuna walked through the hangar, looking at rows of vessels that made even veteran pilots uncomfortable. They were called reckoners. Ships with no shields, minimal life support, and engines powerful enough to accelerate to relativistic speeds. The entire vessel was essentially a guidance system wrapped around a massive kinetic penetrator. They were designed for one mission: ram Vacross, capital ships at a significant fraction of light speed. The missions were one way. Everyone knew it. The volunteer list was still 3 times longer than available ships. Yuna had already flown 12 combat missions in conventional fighters. She had survived each one through a combination of skill and luck. She knew her luck was running out, so she volunteered for the Reckoners, because one successful ramming attack could destroy a Vacross dreadnought, and destroying one dreadnought might save a colony. The mathematics of desperation? Trade 12 human lives to eliminate a ship that carried thousands of Vacross. Keep the ratio favorable. Make every death count for something. You don't have to do this, her squadron commander told her. Yes, I do, Yuna replied. We all do. This is what it takes to win. This is what they forced us to become. The Vacross War Council met in emergency session. The reports from the front were increasingly alarming. The humans had deployed weapons that violated every convention of civilized warfare. Self-replicating nanobombs that consumed Vacross vessels from the inside out. Psychological broadcasts that exploited Vacross neural patterns to induce paralyzing fear. Ships that weren't ships, but guided missiles, piloted by fanatics willing to die for marginal tactical gains. Commander, Taiyang finally understood what Captain Haiyan had been trying to tell him. This wasn't a normal war. Normal wars had rules. Normal wars had limits. Normal wars ended when one side recognized they couldn't win. Humans didn't recognize limits. They recognized only objectives and acceptable costs. We should negotiate, one council member suggested. Offer them their independence. Accept the current borders. We've already committed too much, another argued. If we withdraw now, every subject species will see it as weakness. The empire will collapse. The debate raged for hours. Meanwhile, across human space, factories produced more ships, more weapons, more soldiers. Every human world contributed. Every civilian accepted rationing. Every family sent their members to war. Because humanity had learned a lesson from their own history. Better to pay any price in war than accept subjugation in peace. Captain Haiyan received new orders. The Dominion was committing its reserve fleet, pulling ships from garrison duties across the empire. They were going all in, betting everything on overwhelming force. He typed a final report, knowing it would be deleted unread. The humans are adapting faster than our strategic planning cycle. Every tactic we develop, they counter within weeks. Every weapon we deploy, they reverse engineer and improve. We are not fighting a war of conquest. We are in an evolution race, and they are evolving faster. He deleted the report himself, knowing it was futile. The Dominion couldn't change course now. Pride, bureaucracy, and cultural momentum all pushed toward total commitment. They would continue the war until they won, or until they broke. Haiyan was beginning to suspect which outcome was more likely. In the occupied systems. Junho activated his power generator bombs. Across New Bizen, Vacross bases went dark. In those few minutes of confusion, resistance cells struck everywhere at once. The Vacross lost more troops in one night than in the initial invasion. In orbit around Earth, Yuna and 11 other pilots climbed into their reckoners. They launched together, accelerating toward the Vacross, fleet in humanity's desperate gambit. The war had reached the point where both sides were committed beyond retreat. But only one side understood what total war really meant. 2 years into the war, the galaxy watched in horrified fascination as the Vacross Dominion bled itself white against an enemy 1/10 its size. The empire that had conquered 847 civilizations was losing to number 848. Captain Hyan had stopped filing reports. No one read them anyway. Instead, he spent his time in the intelligence vessel's archives, searching for any scrap of information that might save his people. That's when he found it, buried in corrupted data fragments from a species so old that even their name was forgotten. The encryption was military grade, designed to survive millennia. It had taken the Vakros cryptography teams 2 years to break it, working on the problem whenever they had spare processing power. The file had just been unlocked. Hyan opened it and felt his blood freeze. It was a complete tactical analysis of humanity, written by a civilization that had fought them and lost. The document was thousands of pages long, detailing every aspect of human warfare, psychology, and culture. It ended with a single recommendation in text, 3 times larger than the rest: do not engage humans in total war. The analysis explained why. Humans evolved on a death world where everything wanted to kill them. They developed persistence hunting, the ability to chase prey until it died of exhaustion. They developed pack bonding so strong they would die for complete strangers. They developed abstract thinking that let them imagine scenarios and plan for them generations in advance. Most importantly, they developed a fundamental belief that some things were worth dying for, and that taking your enemy with you was an acceptable outcome. The report detailed specific human cultural concepts: mutually assured destruction, the willingness to destroy yourself if it meant destroying your enemy; Pyrrhic victory, winning at such cost that you might as well have lost; total war, the complete mobilization of every resource toward victory, regardless of cost. It explained that humans had fought wars among themselves for their entire history. They knew war in ways no other species did. They had developed tactics, strategies, and weapons over thousands of years of constant conflict. Every human military commander studied battles from centuries ago, learning lessons and refining techniques. The Vakros had 3,000 years of easy conquest. Humans had 10,000 years of hard warfare. Hyan read the final section with mounting horror. If you are reading this, you have already engaged humans in total war. There is no victory condition that does not involve your extinction or theirs. They will not stop. They will not forgive. They will remember for generations. Your only option is complete surrender and hope they are merciful, or fight to mutual annihilation. He transmitted the file to Commander Taiyang with a priority override. For once, his superior actually read it. On Earth, scientist Soman stood in a laboratory that didn't officially exist. The research conducted here violated every treaty humanity had ever signed, but those treaties were with species who honored such agreements. The Vakros had destroyed 12 human worlds and killed 3 billion people. Treaties were dead. Project Reckoning was the culmination of 2 years of biological warfare research. The team had mapped Vakros biology down to the genetic level using samples collected from battlefields. They had designed a virus so specific it would only affect Vakros physiology. The virus wasn't meant to kill quickly. That would be too merciful. It was designed to sterilize. Any Vakros infected would lose the ability to reproduce within days. The infection was airborne, highly contagious, and had a 2-week incubation period before symptoms appeared. By the time the Vakros realized they were infected, it would be too late. Every major population center would be exposed. In months, the entire species would be unable to have children. In years, they would go extinct. Are we sure about this? One of her team members asked. His name was Quan, a microbiologist who had lost his family when the Vakros bombarded his home colony. Soman looked at him. They gave us a choice: surrender or die. We chose a third option. We chose to make them regret offering those choices. The Terran Council debated the weapon's use in a session that lasted 3 days. Diplomat Ji Wu argued against deployment. She had spent her career building bridges between cultures, finding peaceful solutions to conflicts. Using a genocide weapon went against everything she believed. If we deploy this, we become no better than them, she said. We cross a line that can never be uncrossed. Future generations will judge us as monsters. Veteran Minho stood to respond. He had fought in every major battle of the war. He had seen things that would haunt him until his dying day. His entire family was dead, killed when the Vakros made an example of his home world. They wanted monsters, he said quietly. They wanted to show the galaxy what happens when you refuse the Dominion. So let's show them what happens when you threaten humanity. Let's show them what apex predators look like when you back them into a corner. The vote was close, but the authorization was given. Project Reckoning was approved for deployment, pending final diplomatic options. Those diplomatic options were about to be tested. Commander Tai Yang had finally convinced the War Council to offer terms. The Dominion would cease offensive operations. Both sides would withdraw to their original borders. Reparations would be paid. The war would end. Admiral Doyen received the offer in his command center on Mars. He read it 3 times, then called a meeting of the Terran military leadership. They're offering peace, he said. They're offering survival, Pilot Yuna corrected. She had survived her Reckoner mission through luck and a Vakros targeting error. She had volunteered for another. They want us to let them go so they can rebuild and come back stronger in a generation. They're right, said Hyon, who had defected to the human side 2 months earlier, unable to watch his civilization's suicide. The Dominion cannot conceive of defeat. If you accept these terms, they will honor them only until they rebuild. Then they will return with new weapons and new strategies. So what do you suggest? Daoyun asked. Hyon looked at each human leader in turn. Finish it. End the Dominion completely. It's the only way to ensure your children's safety. The Terran Council voted on the peace offer. The debate was bitter, with families of the dead on both sides. Some argued that accepting peace would honor the sacrifice of those who died. Others argued that their sacrifice would be meaningless if the threat was allowed to survive. The vote failed. Humanity would not accept peace. They would accept only total victory or mutual annihilation. When the Vakros received the rejection, the War Council met in emergency session. They had offered generous terms, more generous than they had ever offered any opponent. The humans had refused. What did that mean? Captain Hyon sent them one final message. It means they're coming. It means they won't stop until the Dominion no longer exists. It means you taught them to fight total war, and now they're better at it than you are. The Dominion began pulling back ships from across their empire, abandoning occupation duties, leaving tributary species unguarded. Every vessel capable of combat was recalled to defend the core systems. The War Council ordered the construction of new defensive installations around their home world. They were going to make a stand. They would show humanity that the Dominion could not be broken. Engineer Jun Ho, still fighting in the occupied systems, received new orders from the Resistance Network. All cells were to activate simultaneously in 72 hours. The final offensive was beginning. Every human, whether in uniform or civilian clothes, had a role to play. Scientist Soman oversaw the loading of Project Reckoning onto stealth ships. The virus was contained in atmospheric dispersion units that looked like standard cargo containers. They would be delivered to Vakros population centers by human operatives who had never come home. Pilot Yuna climbed into her fighter, part of a fleet that now outnumbered the Vakros 3-1. 2 years of total industrial mobilization had turned humanity's entire economy into a war machine. Every factory produced weapons. Every shipyard built warships. Every human worked toward one goal: survival through complete elimination of the threat. The final battle was coming. The Vakros prepared to defend their home world with everything they had. They still believed they could win. They still believed their superior technology and defensive positions would carry the day. They had learned nothing from 2 years of warfare. Humans didn't fight fair. Humans didn't honor conventions. Humans fought to win, and if winning was impossible, they fought to ensure their enemy lost too. The galaxy was about to witness the final lesson in what happens when you ignore warnings about humanity. Operation Final Warning began at midnight. Galactic Standard Time. Across 70 occupied systems, resistance cells activated simultaneously. Engineer Junho's group on New Bizin was just one of thousands. They struck military installations, destroyed supply depots, sabotaged communications, and created chaos behind enemy lines. The Vakros garrison forces found themselves fighting an enemy they couldn't see. Every civilian was potentially hostile. Every building might contain a bomb. Every street could be a kill zone. The occupiers retreated to their fortified bases and called for reinforcement. But there were no reinforcements to send. Every Vakros ship was needed at the home world. The human fleet emerged from hyperspace in a sphere formation that surrounded the Vakros core system. Admiral Doyun commanded from the dreadnought Indomitable, a ship built from the scrapped remains of 20 colony vessels. Nothing about it was elegant or traditional. It was a weapon, pure and simple. All ships sound off, he ordered. The reports came in. 50,000 combat vessels. Another 20,000 support ships. Troop transports carrying Marine divisions that had trained for 2 years for this moment. Medical ships ready to treat casualties. Supply vessels loaded with enough ammunition to fight for months, and hidden among them, unmarked and unregistered, the stealth ships carrying Project Reckoning. The Vakros defenders numbered 15,000 ships, but they held defensive positions around their fortress world. Orbital platforms bristled with weapons. Planetary shields covered every major city. Fighter bases dotted the moons. This was the Dominion's final stand, and they had prepared every defense their civilization could devise. Pilot Yuna flew in the first wave, her fighter part of a swarm that numbered in the thousands. The Vakros point defense systems opened fire, filling space with energy beams and projectiles. Fighters died by the hundreds, but for every one destroyed, 3 more pushed through. The Vakros had superior weapons. They had better shields. They had defensive positions. But they were fighting an enemy that had spent 2 years learning to trade favorable casualty ratios. Humanity was willing to lose 3 ships to destroy 1. Because they had built 6 ships for every one, the Vakros fielded Captain Hyan watched from Doyun's flagship. His role now as advisor rather than warrior. He saw his people's final defense and knew it was futile. Not because they lacked courage or capability, but because they were fighting an enemy that refused to acknowledge the possibility of defeat. The human Marines breached the orbital platforms using tactics that made Hyan sick. They packed boarding pods with soldiers and explosives, and crashed the pods into Vakros stations. The soldiers had minutes to complete their objectives before the explosives detonated, destroying the station and everyone on it. Suicide missions. Dozens of them happening simultaneously, each one eliminating a defensive position at the cost of human lives. But there were always more humans willing to pay that cost. The Vakros War Council watched their defenses crumble and finally understood what Captain Hyan had been trying to tell them for 2 years. This wasn't a war. It was an extermination. The humans weren't fighting to conquer. They were fighting to eliminate a threat permanently. Commander Tai Yang authorized the use of weapons the Dominion had kept in reserve. Biological weapons that could devastate a planet's ecosystem. Chemical agents that could kill millions. nuclear devices that could crack a world's crust. Everything they had deployed in desperation. The human fleet accepted the damage and continued advancing. Ships died by the thousands, but the advance never stopped. For every weapon the Vakros deployed, humanity had a counter developed from 2 years of total war research. Scientist Somin gave the order from her position in the fleet. The stealth ships broke formation and began their approach to the Vakros homeworld. Their drives were silent. Their hulls were coated in materials that absorbed sensor beams. They looked like debris from the massive battle raging around them. The Vakros detected 3 of the 12 stealth ships and destroyed them. 9 got through. The atmospheric dispersion units deployed over major population centers. The virus began spreading immediately, invisible and undetectable. The 2-week incubation period meant no one would know they were infected until it was too late. On the surface, the Vakros leadership made one final decision. They would broadcast a surrender, offer complete capitulation, and hope for mercy. Admiral Do-Yun received the transmission. The War Council promised total disarmament, war crimes tribunals for all military leaders, reparations to humanity for damages caused. Everything humanity could possibly demand, offered without negotiation. He gave them 72 hours to comply with initial terms. All military vessels to power down their weapons and shields. All planetary defenses to deactivate. All government officials to report for processing. The Vakros began compliance immediately. Ships went dark. Shields dropped. Leaders presented themselves for arrest. The mighty Dominion surrendered unconditionally, hoping that submission would spare them complete destruction. But Project Reckoning was already deployed. The virus was spreading through the population. In 9 days, the first symptoms would appear: sterility, inability to reproduce. The Vakros would realize they had been infected before the surrender was offered. Veteran Minho stood on the surface of the Vakros homeworld, part of the occupation force. He watched Vakros citizens going about their daily lives, unaware that their species was already extinct. In a generation, maybe 2, they would all be dead. No children would be born. Their civilization would fade into history. He felt no satisfaction, no joy, just a deep weariness that came from understanding what humanity had become. They had been forced to become monsters to survive, and monsters they had become. Diplomat Ji Woo processed war criminals in a makeshift tribunal. Commander Tai Yang was among them, the once proud military leader, now a broken figure awaiting judgment. She read the charges against him, crimes that included the destruction of entire worlds. Did you know? She asked him. Did you know what would happen if you threatened humanity? Tai Yang looked at her with his 4 eyes, each one reflecting despair. We read the warnings. We thought they were exaggerations. We thought we were different. We thought our strength would be enough. It wasn't about strength, Ji-Woo said quietly. It was about will. You were willing to conquer. We were willing to die. The second will always defeats the first. Captain Haiyan sat in his cell, waiting for his own trial. He had defected, helped humanity, provided intelligence that saved human lives and cost Vakros ones. But he was still a war criminal for his early actions in the war. He had accepted his fate. He had known what would happen when he sent those first warnings, the ones nobody read. He had watched his entire civilization march toward extinction, because pride mattered more than survival. Admiral Do-Yun stood on the bridge of his flagship, watching the Vakros homeworld turn slowly below. The war was over. Humanity had won. But the cost was almost unbearable. 3 billion human dead. 12 worlds destroyed. An entire generation traumatized by total war. And the knowledge that they had committed genocide to survive. He gave the order to begin humanitarian aid. Food shipments to Vakros worlds. Medical supplies. reconstruction assistance. Because humans, even after everything, still tried to help their defeated enemies. It was part of their nature, the same nature that made them deadly when threatened. Pilot Una walked through a memorial park being constructed on Mars. 3 billion names would be carved into stone. 3 billion people who died because an empire refused to leave them alone. She found the section with her squadron's names and stood in silence. They had won. The threat was eliminated. But winning felt hollow when the price was so high back on Earth. The Terran Council met to discuss the future. The galaxy was watching. Hundreds of species had observed the war, seen what humanity was capable of when pushed to the edge. Now those species wanted to know what humanity would do with victory. The decision was unanimous. The Vacross would be helped to rebuild, given autonomy over their own worlds, and treated as defeated enemies rather than permanent threats. The virus would be kept secret, its existence denied. Let history record that the Vacross Empire fell to conventional warfare, not genocide. In another generation, when the last Vacross died, the galaxy would assume they had simply faded away, unable to recover from their military defeat. Only a handful of humans would know the truth. Scientist Soman deleted all records of Project Reckoning. She destroyed the research data, the virus samples, and every piece of evidence that it had existed. Then she resigned and spent the rest of her life working on medical research, trying to balance the scales of her soul. Years passed. The galaxy reorganized. Species that had been subjects of the Vacross Dominion established their own governments. Some allied with humanity. Others kept their distance, wary of a species that had destroyed an empire that had ruled for 3,000 years. A memorial was established on what had been the Vacross home world. It listed every species the Dominion had destroyed, conquered, or enslaved. And at the bottom, a simple plaque with a simple message. They ignored every warning. Learn from their mistake. The galaxy learned. Humanity was added to every species database with a new classification. Not as enemies. Not as allies. But as the species you leave alone unless you're prepared for total war. Because that's what the warnings had always said. The ancient civilizations that fought humans and lost had tried to tell everyone who would listen. Don't mistake human kindness for weakness. Don't confuse their desire for peace with inability to wage war. And most importantly, never, ever push them to the point where they stop trying to win and start trying to take you with them. The Vacross Empire became a cautionary tale, a warning carved into galactic history. And humanity became something else entirely. Not conquerors, not an empire, but the species that would accept friendship, offer trade, share technology, and live in peace with anyone willing to reciprocate. Right up until the moment someone decided to test them. Then they became what 3 billion years of evolution on a death world had created. Survivors, at any cost, by any means necessary. With a memory that lasted generations, and a willingness to ensure that whoever threatened them would not survive. To threaten their children, the galaxy learned to leave humanity alone. And humanity, bearing the scars of what they had to become, tried to remember who they used to be before the Vacross, forced them to choose between extinction and becoming monsters. They had survived. But the cost was written in the stars.